In the last section, we enhanced our test suite by adding a nodemon command to automatically rerun our tests whenever anything changes. And so functionally, it's just going to make sure that it's a lot easier to see some very live output from our test suite. If you have two monitors, a great practice is to put this terminal window on the second window, and then you can just, or second monitor, excuse me, and then anytime you change any code in here, you can just glance over at the second monitor and make sure all the tests are running. Of course, for me recording, we only got the one monitor, so I'm just going to keep everything on one window or one monitor and just alt-tab between the two. Anyways, time to get back to our actual tests. We now have made use of Mongoose to find a very particular, or I should say not a very particular, but any user inside of our users collection with a name of Joe. So now I want to go back and make use of the find one method to find a very particular user inside of our collection. Now, because in theory we might have many different users with a name of Joe, I want to try to find a user with specifically the ID of Joe, the one that we already saved up here. And so this use case of finding a user with a particular ID would be whenever we know the ID of a record, but we don't actually know any other criteria about it. And so this actually ends up happening rather frequently in a web environment, and it's something that we'll see later on inside this course. So since I'm writing a new test, I'm going to add in a second it block. And the purpose of this test will be to find a user with a particular ID. And I'll add in my callback again. Again, because we've seen this many times now, I am trying to find we're trying to make an operation that's going to touch Mongoose. So we will use the done callback in here because it's going to be an asynchronous test. So now inside of the test suite, or inside of the it block, we'll add on a call to user.findOne. As a reminder, whenever we kind of want to work with the entire collection, we use the model class of user. Whenever we want to work with a very particular record, that's when we start to use new user and then manipulate the user instance that gets returned. So I want to find a user with a very particular ID. In many other frameworks or ORMs, they have a lot of helper methods where you can sometimes just pass in, say like find something and just pass in the ID of the record you want to find. Unfortunately, Mongoose doesn't have the same functionality. It really expects you to always be passing in an object that's going to serve as the criteria that you want to use for your search. So we're going to pass in an object, and we're going to say, I want to find the first record with an underscore ID of Joe._ID. Notice that in this case, we don't have to use the toString because we're not doing any type of comparison or anything like that. Internally, Mongoose knows exactly how to work with that object ID thing. So Joe._ID right here is an object ID object, but Mongoose knows how to deal with that. So we can just say, here's the entire object ID, go find a record with an ID that looks like this. So this will tell Mongoose to go off and find the first user with this very particular ID. And then as we are very well getting used to, we can add on a .then case, which will be called with the very particular and single user that gets retrieved. So remember the big difference between find and find one. Find one returns a single record, find returns an array of records. So now we need an assert statement inside of here. So what might be a good assert inside of here? We could look at the ID and just compare the ID. Maybe another good assert statement would be to look at the name of the returned user and make sure that it's Joe. So I'm going to say assert user.name == Joe. And then we'll call done to wrap up the test. So I'll save this. Let's see how we're doing. And we got 3 passing tests. Just to make sure that everything's working the way we expect, I'm going to change that to mark, which is definitely going to fail. And yep, we see a nice big error message. Let's go back to Joe. Much better. Okay, so in this section, we saw the difference between find and find one. We also saw how we look up records with a very particular ID. So we're starting to kind of develop the range of tools that we have with Mongoose so far. We can insert records, we can find very particular records. Let's get into our next section where we're going to start to figure out how we modify existing records inside of our user's collection.